Long ago, before the oldest man in Adum could remember, there stood at the heart of the village a great baobab tree. Its roots stretched deep into the earth and its branches spread so wide that at sunset, they cast a shadow large enough to shelter half the village. Adum was not known for its riches. There were no palaces, no mountains of gold, and no warriors whose names inspired fear across the land. Yet people traveled from distant kingdoms to visit it. They came for one reason: stories. Every evening, when the day's work was done and the goats had returned to their pens, the people of Adum gathered beneath the baobab tree. The air would fill with the smell of roasted plantains and wood smoke, while children hurried to claim the best places near the elders. "Tell us about the leopard king," one child would shout. "No, tell us how the moon learned to shine," another would insist. The elders would laugh and say, "Patience, little ones. Every story has its own time." And among the branches above them, hidden from sight, sat Anansi the spider. He listened to every tale. He collected every proverb. He knew every secret. For Anansi understood something the villagers often forgot. Stories are treasures that cannot be locked away in a chest. They live only when they are shared. Welcome to the Afro Tales with Kemi, where African stories are told slowly, honestly, and with meaning. This channel is more than a show. It is the foundation of the Afro Tales Academy, a movement built on one belief: that African wisdom should shape how we lead, how we train, and how we govern. If you have ever felt that in your bones, you are already part of this. So sit back, open your heart, and walk with me through today's tale, told as always the African way. I am Kemi Iwalesi. One bright morning, young Kojo ran into his grandmother's hut carrying a carved wooden toy. "Grandmother," he cried, "tell me the story of the turtle who outrun the river." The old woman smiled. "Ha, that's my favorite story." But as she opened her mouth to speak, her smile faded. She frowned. "Strange. What is it, Grandma?" I cannot remember." Kojo laughed. "You're joking." "No, child. I remember there was a turtle and perhaps a river." She pressed her hand against her forehead. "But the rest is gone." Before Kojo could respond, his mother burst through the doorway. "Mama, have you forgotten the harvest song?" "Yes, so has father." Soon, cries began to rise from every corner of the village. "I cannot remember my wedding song. I have forgotten my father's proverb. What was the tale of the 7 sisters?" By midday, a terrible truth has settled over Adum like a dark cloud. Every story had vanished. That evening, the villagers gathered beneath the baobab tree as they always had. But for the first time in living memory, no one spoke. The village drummer lifted his hands and stared at his instrument. "I do not remember the rhythm of the harvest." The chief lowered his head. "I cannot remember the oath I swore when I became chief." Mothers sat quietly beside their children. Even the wind seemed unwilling to disturb the silence. Little Kojo tugged at his mother's wrapper. "Mama, what do we do now?" Tears filled his eyes. "I do not know." Above them, Anansi shifted uneasily in his web. For unlike the others, he remembered everything, every story, every proverb, every song. And though he tried to hide it, a small smile slowly spread across his face. "At last," whispered Anansi, Do you know what this means? He danced across his web with delight. I am the richest creature in all of Adum. The next morning, he descended from the baobab tree carrying himself with unusual importance. Good people of Adum, he announced. Perhaps I can help. You remember the stories? Gasped the villagers. Anansi puffed out his chest. Every single one. Please, cried an elder. Tell us the story of the leopard king. Certainly, said Anansi, for one basket of yams. The villagers exchanged confused glances. And the harvest song? Asked another. 2 chickens. By sunset, Anansi's heart was overflowing with gifts. Never in all his years had he eaten so well. That night, as he sat surrounded by baskets of fruits and sacks of grain, he laughed until tears rolled down his face. Who knew stories could be so profitable? By the end of the 3rd day, Anansi had become the busiest creature in the village. From sunrise till the stars appeared, there was always a line outside his little hut near the baobab tree. One proverb, please, an old farmer would say, carrying a basket of cassava. That will be 3 sweet potatoes and a mango. Anansi replied without hesitation. 3 sweet potatoes? For a proverb? Do you want wisdom or not? Said Anansi, folding all 8 of his arms across his chest. The farmer sighed and handed over the payment. Anansi cleared his throat dramatically. Aha! Here is today's proverb. The lizard that jumps from the high Iroko tree praises itself if no one else will. The farmer nodded slowly. That is a good proverb. Of course it is, said Anansi. I have thousands more. By sunset, his heart filled with gifts. Yams stacked to the ceiling, calabashes of palm oil lined against the walls, and enough granules to feed an entire family for a year. Never has Anansi been so happy. At last, he said, reclining on a pile of cushions, the world is finally paying stories what they are worth. But as the days turned into weeks, something strange began to happen in Adum. The children no longer sat quietly in the evenings. Without the stories of brave hunters and wise queens, they had no examples to follow. They argued over the smallest things. They mocked their elders. They laughed at traditions they no longer understood. One afternoon, little Kojo pointed to the great baobab tree and asked his mother, "Why do we gather there every evening?" His mother opened her mouth to answer. Then she stopped. She did not know. The annual festival harvest came and went without celebration because no one remembered the songs. 2 brothers who had farmed side by side for 40 years began to quarrel over a narrow footpath. Father would know how to settle this one said. Then ask him, replied the other. But their father had forgotten every lesson his father had ever taught him. Even the chief seemed diminished. One morning, he stood before the village council and said quietly, "I remember being made chief. I remember the drums. I remember the people cheering." He lowered his eyes. "But I cannot remember what I promised them." For the first time in generations, Adum was becoming a village without a memory. Yet, Anansi noticed none of this. He was far too busy counting his blessings. Every evening, he spread his treasures across the floor of his hut. 37 yams, he announced proudly, 12 chickens, 4 baskets of oranges, and 1 goat, all for the story of why the sun chases the moon. He chuckled. If I had known stories were this valuable, I would have stolen all of them years ago. He spent his days polishing his collection of gifts and admiring himself in a bowl of water. Anansi, he said to his reflection, you are not merely a spider, you are a genius. But late at night, when the village was quiet, he would hear something that troubled him. Silence. No laughter beneath the baobab. No children begging for one more tale. No old women arguing about whether a story had been told correctly. Only silence. Strange, Anansi murmured one evening. A village with no stories is quieter than a graveyard. Then he shrugged. Not my problem. And he went back to counting his yam. It happened on the 21st day after the stories disappeared. The sun was sinking beyond the hills when an old woman arrived at the edge of Adu. Her clothes were worn from travel, and her walking stick had been smoothed by many years of use. Dust covered her feet, yet her eyes shone like stars reflected upon water. She stopped before the baobab tree and looked around. What sorrow had visited this place, she asked. No one answered. At last, little Kojo stepped forward. Our stories have left us. The old woman nodded as though she had expected this. And where is Anansi? The villagers pointed towards the spider's hut. She found him asleep atop a mountain of yams. Wake up, keeper of stories. Anansi opened one eye. If you are here for a story, you have to wait until tomorrow. I have not come to buy a story. Then why are you here? The old woman leaned upon her staff. Because Nyame, Lord of the Sky, is disappointed in you. Anansi sat up so quickly that he tumbled from his pile of cushions. Nyame knows my name? The old woman smiled. Nyame knows every name. Listen carefully, Anansi, said the old woman. The stories weren't stolen. They weren't? No. Then where did they go? They left. Anansi laughed. The stories cannot walk. No, said the woman, but they can choose where they belong. She pointed toward the silent baobab tree. For many years, the people of Adum honored their stories. They listened. They remembered. They passed them from one generation to the next. Her expression grew sad. Then they became busy. She spoke of children who preferred games to listening, of adults who hurried home before the evening gathering, and of leaders who believed stories were only for the young. The stories grew lonely, Anansi. Stories can be lonely. Everything that is neglected becomes lonely. The spider had no answer. So Nyame gathered them and placed them in 7 sacred calabashes hidden deep within the forest of echoes. And if they remained there, the old woman's gaze swept across the village. Then Adum will forget itself completely. For the first time in many days, Anansi did not think about yams. He thought about silence. Then I suppose you should go and fetch them, said Anansi quickly, already settling back onto his cushions. The old woman laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, nor was it a kind one. It was the laugh of someone who had lived long enough to recognize foolishness when she heard it. Oh no, little spider. The stories remember their keeper. Anansi froze. Keeper? Who listened when the elders spoke? Well, I did. Who sat in the baobab tree and collected every proverb? I did. Who remembers every story in Adum? Anansi's shoulders slumped. I do. Then Nyame has chosen you. There must be a mistake, said Anansi. I am very busy. Busy doing what? Anansi looked around his hut, organizing my yams. The old woman raised an eyebrow. You have until the next full moon. If the stories are not returned by them, Adum will forget not only its stories, but its names, its songs, and eventually each other. Each other? Tell me, Anansi, what is a village without its memories? The spider had never considered such a question. Before he could answer, the old woman turned and walked into the gathering darkness. Wait, Anansi called. How will I find the forest of echoes? Without turning, she replied, follow the path that remembers your footsteps. That doesn't make any sense. It will. The next morning, the villagers gathered before the baobab tree. Word had spread quickly. Anansi was leaving to retrieve the stories. Will he succeed? Whispered one woman. He is Anansi, said an elder. Success and trouble follow him in equal measure. Little Kojo stepped forward carrying a small pouch. For your journey, Anansi opened it. Inside were roasted groundnuts. They are my favorites, said Kojo. You are giving me your favorite food? The boy nodded. Because you are bringing back our stories. Anansi looked at the pouch for a long moment. No one had ever given him something without expecting anything in return. The chief approached carrying a walking stick carved with symbols. This belonged to my father, he said. I cannot remember what the symbols mean, but perhaps one day I will. Anansi accepted the staff awkwardly. I should warn you, he said. I have never rescued anything in my life. Then this seems an excellent time to begin, replied the chief. As Anansi walked away from Adum, he looked back once. The villagers stood together beneath the baobab tree, waving silently. It occurred to him then that he had spent his entire life taking things from people. He had never once left with their hopes. The path beyond Adum twisted through tall grasses and ancient trees. By midday, Anansi was exhausted. Ridiculous, he muttered. Who hides stories in a forest? He had walked for hours when he noticed something strange. The footprints behind him were not disappearing. They glowed faintly on the earth. That is unsettling. Curious, he stepped up the path. Instantly, the glowing footprints vanished. Ha! He stepped back. The footprints returned. Follow the path that remembers your footsteps, he repeated slowly. For the first time, the old woman's words made sense. As evening approached, the wind carried whispers through trees. At first, Anansi thought it was rustling of leaves. Then he heard the words. The moon does not envy the stars. A river remembers every stone. Wisdom enters quietly. There were fragments of stories, forgotten stories. The closer he came to the forest of echoes, the louder the whispers became. And somewhere in the distance, something whispered his name. Anansi! By dawn, Anansi stood at the edge of the forest of echoes. It was unlike any forest he had ever seen. The trees seemed to breathe. The shadows moved when no one was watching, and everywhere voices filled the air. Thousands upon thousands of voices. In the center of a clearing sat the first calabash. Beside it was an inscription. He who keeps stories must first learn to listen. I've spent my whole life listening, said Anansi proudly. The calabash remained closed. Very well, I shall listen harder. He sat beside it. Minutes passed, then hours. He listened to the wind. He listened to the birds. He listened to the distant sound of water. At sunset, he heard someone else cry. It was faint and sorrowful. "Who is there?" he called. The voice answered, "We are the stories." Anansi's eyes widened. "Stories can cry? Wouldn't you?" they replied, after being forgotten. And for the first time in his long and mischievous life, Anansi did not speak. He simply listened. The first calabash cracked open with a sound like distant thunder. The second calabash sat beside a fallen tree. Its inscription read, "He who keeps stories must serve without reward." Nearby, Anansi found an old tortoise trapped beneath a heavy branch. "Please," said the tortoise weakly, "help me." "What is in it for me?" asked Anansi automatically. The tortoise blinked. "Nothing." "Nothing? Must kindness always have a price?" Anansi sighed dramatically and lifted the branch. The moment the tortoise was free, the second calabash opened. "Interesting," murmured Anansi. The third calabash was waiting beside a stream. Its inscription read, "He who keeps stories must teach the young." There, Anansi found a young bird struggling to build its first nest. "You are doing it all wrong," he said. "Then teach me," said the bird. So Anansi spent the afternoon teaching the little bird everything he knew about patience, balance, and perseverance. By sunset, the bird's nest stood proudly among the branches. Crack! The third calabash opened. Anansi stared at it thoughtfully. He was beginning to suspect that Inyame was teaching him far more than he had intended. The deeper Anansi journeyed into the forest of echoes, the less it resembled a forest and the more it resembled a memory. Trees whispered the names of ancestors, streams hummed forgotten lullabies. Even the stars above seemed to arrange themselves into ancient symbols. By the second night, Anansi came upon the fourth calabash. It sat upon a stone between two men who were shouting at one another. "The land belongs to my family," cried the first. "No, it belongs to mine," shouted the second. Between them stood a mango tree so old that its branches bent with age. The inscription on the calabash read, "He who keeps stories must restore peace." "Oh no," said Anansi. "Not people. I prefer riddles." He listened as the men argued late into the night. At last he noticed something peculiar. Neither man could remember who had planted the mango tree. "Tell me," said Anansi, "if neither of you remembers its beginning, why are you fighting over its end?" The men fell silent. Then from somewhere deep within their memories, one of them began to laugh. "Our grandfathers planted it together." "Then perhaps," said Anansi gently, "they intended for you to share its shade." The two men embraced and the fourth calabash opened. "This is becoming suspiciously satisfying," Anansi muttered. The fifth calabash stood at the top of a hill beside a single sapling. Its inscription read, "He who keeps stories must plant for those he will never meet." Beside the sapling lay a small shovel. "You cannot be serious," said Anansi. "I am a spider. We are not known for gardening." Yet, he planted the sapling and carried water from a nearby stream until the soil was down. As he walked, he found himself wondering, who will sit beneath this tree? Who will tell stories in its shade? The thought lingered long after the fifth calabash had opened. The sixth calabash waited beside a small hut at the edge of the forest. Outside sat an old man turning a carved wooden ring over in his hands. Tears filled his eyes. "What troubles you?" asked Anansi. "This ring belonged to my wife," said the old man. "I promised to give it to my granddaughter when she came of age." He shook his head sadly. "But I have forgotten where she lives." The inscription upon the calabash read, "He who keeps stories must return what has been forgotten." "Wonderful," sighed Anansi. "Now I am expected to solve family matters." The old man described his granddaughter as best as he could. "She laughs before she speaks and sings when she walks." For 3 days, Anansi searched the forest village. At last, he found a young woman beside a river, singing as she washed clothes. "Do you happen to have a grandfather who forgets important things?" he asked. She smiled. "Only one. When she received the ring, she wept." "He remembered me?" "No," said Anansi honestly. "He forgot you, but he never stopped loving you." The young woman embraced the old man so tightly that he began to cry as well. Crack! The 6th calabash opened. Anansi watched the reunion quietly. There had been a time when he would have charged a fee for such a service. Now he found that the gratitude in their eyes felt strangely valuable. At last, Anansi stood before the final calabash. It rested upon a pedestal of stone in the deepest part of the forest of echoes. Unlike others, it was enormous, large enough to hold 1,000 stories. Its inscription read, "He who keeps stories must give them away freely." "Absolutely not," said Anansi immediately. The forest fell silent. "Do you have any idea how difficult this journey has been?" The calabash remained closed. "I have listened. I have helped strangers. I have planted trees." Silence. Then the voices of the stories rose around him. "Why do you love us, Anansi?" "Because you are valuable." "And what happens when valuable things are hidden away?" Anansi thought of Adum. He thought of the silent baobab. Finally, he sat down before the calabash. "Very well," he said softly. He thought of little Kojo offering him his favorite groundnuts. "I will tell one story. No payment, no bargains, no tricks." And so beneath the stars, Anansi began. Once there was a very foolish spider who believed stories belonged to him. He spoke through the night. He spoke of mistakes and loneliness, of villages and memories, of the strange burden of being entrusted with something greater than oneself. By dawn, tears covered his face. He had not realized until that moment that the story he had been telling was his own. With a sound like thunder rolling across the heavens, the 7th calabash burst open. The moment the 7th calabash opened, all 7 rose into the air. They cracked apart like eggs beneath the morning sun, and from them poured the stories, thousands upon thousands of them. They took the form of golden birds, shimmering butterflies, and ribbons of light that danced through the trees. Some carried songs, others carried proverbs, others still carried the names of forgotten ancestors. The entire sky blazed with stories returning home. "Go!" cried Anansi. "They've been waiting for you." The stories swept over him like a warm wind before racing towards Adum. For a moment, the forest of echoes became brighter than daylight. And then suddenly, it was quiet. The journey was over. When Anansi finally returned to Adum, the village was transformed. Children ran through the streets shouting stories to one another. Mothers sang forgotten lullabies. The village drummer had not stopped playing since sunrise. Beneath the baobab tree, the chief stood waiting. "I remember my oath," he said. "And what was it?" asked Anansi. The chief smiled. "To leave the village better than I found it." Little Kojo came running forward. "Anansi, tell us a story." The spider opened his mouth automatically. "That will cost..." He stopped. The villagers laughed. Anansi laughed too. "Old habits," he admitted. That evening, beneath the great baobab tree, the people of Adum gathered once more. They listened as Anansi told tales of a foolish spider who had traveled to the forest of echoes. And for the first time in his life, he told a story for no other reward than the joy of sharing it. Years later, when the children of Adum had become elders themselves, they would still tell the story of the time the village lost its stories. They would point to the great baobab tree and say, "A people may survive without riches. They may survive without power, but they must never survive without their stories." As for Anansi, he still lives amongst the branches of the baobab tree. Some nights, if the moon is full and the wind is gentle, travelers claim they can hear his voice drifting through the darkness. "Come closer, my friends. This one is free." And if you should ever find yourself in a village where stories are still told beneath the stars, sit down and listen. For stories are more than words. They are the memory of a people. They are the wisdom of those who came before us. They are the inheritance we leave behind. Every story is a mirror. Where did you see yourself in this one?
When the drum speaks, Africa remembers. When stories rise, hearts awaken. Afro Tales we rise.